Something about that room didn't feel illegal, and that was the problem. I was standing alone at a heavy oak desk inside a locked study at the heart of Blackthorn Mansion, staring at a stack of handwritten ledgers that were never meant to be public. The house had a reputation in town: cursed, dangerous, full of secrets. But there were no cobwebs here, no signs of madness, just order, dates, names, careful ink. I had come looking for scandal. Instead, I found records, hundreds of them, documenting private interventions, quiet settlements, moments when someone stepped in before a life unraveled. Why keep something like this hidden? And more importantly, who was it really protecting? One of the ledgers was still open where I'd left it, a single sentence underlined in the margin. I read it again, slower this time. One of the names in those ledgers still runs a business on Main Street. Another works at the local school. If I publish what's in that room, their worst day won't stay in the past. If you're new here, you might want to follow along, because this is one of those stories where every detail matters. I thought I was about to expose a town's darkest secrets. I didn't realize I was about to question whether they should ever be exposed at all. Let me tell you how I ended up in that locked room in the first place. The first time I heard about Blackthorn Mansion, it wasn't in a newsroom. It was over coffee at a diner off Route 16. The kind of place where conversations slow down when a stranger walks in. I was in town chasing a completely different story. Zoning disputes, small-town politics, nothing dramatic. But when I mentioned I was a reporter, someone at the counter glanced toward the hill visible through the window and said, almost casually, "If you want a real story, you should look into that house." I followed his gaze. Even from a distance, the place stood apart. Dark stone, tall windows, no visible movement. It didn't look abandoned exactly, just self-contained, like it didn't need the town below it. "People say there are files in there," the man added. "Records, things that could ruin folks." He didn't elaborate, and no one else jumped in to clarify. That was the first thing that struck me. Usually when a rumor starts, people compete to tell it. Here, they pulled back. Someone changed the subject. Coffee cups clinked. It was as if the house had crossed an invisible line in the room. I didn't think much of it at first. Small towns always have a house like that. A place that collects suspicion the way older cities collect smog. But later that evening, I did what reporters do. I started asking quiet questions. The pattern repeated. People knew of the mansion. They knew about records. They believed those records contained leverage, documents, letters, proof of things that had almost happened or nearly been exposed. But no one could name a single concrete example. It was all secondhand. Always a friend of a friend. Always something that almost surfaced. That kind of vagueness usually means one of two things. Either the story is empty, or it's been deliberately contained. A retired teacher agreed to speak with me off the record. We met in her living room, blinds half drawn. She told me the mansion had belonged to one family for generations, that the last owner rarely appeared in public, that deliveries were made regularly, archival boxes, filing cabinets, preservation supplies. She kept everything, the teacher said. Not gossip, documentation. Of what? I asked. Of moments that could have gone badly. That phrasing stayed with me. Back at my hotel, I ran a basic search. Property records confirmed long-term ownership. No lawsuits tied to the address. No police reports. No fire inspections or health violations. If anything, the place was remarkably clean on paper. That in itself was unusual. Buildings that old almost always accumulate some kind of public trail. Instead, what I found were mentions in local meeting minutes, requests from a historical society years ago asking for access to archival materials reportedly housed at the Blackthorn estate. The request had been declined. Politely. Firmly. Archival materials. That was the first official phrase attached to the rumor. If there was a locked room in that mansion filled with ledgers, if there were handwritten records cataloging disputes, settlements, near scandals, then the story wasn't about ghosts or curses. It was about information. And information, handled quietly for decades, becomes power. I wish I could say my interest was purely civic, that I was motivated by transparency. The truth is simpler. I was between major pieces. My last investigative series had landed well, but not explosively. I needed something larger, something layered, something that traveled beyond a single town. A hidden archive inside a feared mansion? That had weight. But I also sensed resistance. Not aggressive resistance, protective resistance. When I asked one local business owner whether he believed the mansion held damaging files, he paused before answering. "If it does," he said carefully, "they've never been used to hurt anyone." That was an odd defense. I hadn't accused anyone of harm. 2 days later, I sent a formal letter to the current owner requesting access for research. I expected silence. Instead, I received a response within 24 hours. Brief, direct. I could visit. I could observe. But I would not be allowed to remove or copy materials without explicit permission. That condition told me everything. There was something in that house worth protecting. The drive up the hill was quieter than I expected. No broken gates. No warning signs, just a gravel path and a structure that looked less haunted than deliberate. The front door opened before I knocked. The woman who greeted me wasn't reclusive or eccentric. She was steady, measured. She knew exactly why I was there. "You've heard stories," she said, not unkindly. "I've heard there are records." "There are," she replied. "And they're not what people think." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. I noticed her eyes drift briefly toward the staircase behind her, toward the upper floor. We sat first in a formal parlor. She spoke about preservation, about responsibility, about how narratives can spiral when context disappears. She never denied the existence of a locked study. She never confirmed it either. But when I asked directly whether the mansion housed written accounts of private matters, she didn't flinch. "Yes," she said, "carefully kept." "And why keep them?" I asked. "Because forgetting is sometimes more dangerous than remembering." That wasn't the answer I expected. I had anticipated defensiveness. Instead, there was conviction. She stood after a moment and gestured toward the staircase. "If you're going to write about this house," she said, "you should at least see what you're talking about." My pulse ticked up, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the threshold, not of a haunted room, of a controlled archive. If the rumors were exaggerated, I would confirm that. If they were true, I would be standing inside something that had quietly shaped lives for decades. At the top of the stairs, the hallway narrowed. The air felt cooler. She stopped before a door darker than the rest. No dramatic pause, no warning. She reached into her pocket and removed a key. Before she turned it, she looked at me once more. "What you find in there," she said evenly, "is not ammunition." Then the lock clicked and the door opened. I thought I was about to find proof of corruption. I wasn't prepared for what those shelves were actually holding. The door didn't creak when it opened. It swung inward smoothly, almost quietly, as if it had been used more recently than anyone in town would guess. I had expected dust, neglect, something dramatic to match the rumors. Instead, the room felt controlled, preserved, intentional. The first thing I noticed wasn't the desk or the window. It was the walls. Every inch of them lined with shelves. Not decorative shelves, not random storage. Structured shelving. Boxes labeled by year. Leather-bound ledgers arranged in chronological order. Archival cases stacked neatly on lower levels. There was no chaos here, no frantic hoarding. Whatever this room held, it had been curated. I stepped inside without speaking. The woman who owned the house remained near the door, but didn't hover. She didn't narrate. She didn't defend. She let the room speak for itself. From the outside, people imagined scandal, blackmail, secret confessions, proof of corruption. Standing in that space, the story shifted. This wasn't a vault for explosive secrets. It was closer to a private library. I moved toward the nearest shelf and ran a finger lightly along the spine of one ledger. The leather was worn but cared for. Each volume bore a year embossed in gold. No dramatic titles, just time. That alone told me something important. This wasn't a collection assembled around one incident. It was ongoing, systematic. "How many are there?" I asked quietly. "Enough," she replied. I selected a volume from the middle of the shelf. She didn't stop me. The cover opened without resistance. Inside, the handwriting was meticulous. Steady ink, evenly spaced entries, each page dated, each entry structured almost like a case file. Name, context, risk, intervention, outcome. At first glance, it looked harmless. It took 3 more entries for me to realize how much damage this room could actually do. I paused at the word intervention. The first entry I read described a local contractor accused, years ago, of skimming funds from a community project. The rumor had spread quickly. According to the ledger, there had been private financial confusion, misfiled invoices, poor bookkeeping, but no theft. The writer documented meetings, clarified misunderstandings, facilitated restitution before the accusation escalated publicly. The final line read, "Matter resolved, reputation preserved." No accusation, no threat, no leverage, just documentation. I turned another page, a different family. A teenage incident that could have resulted in criminal charges but had been redirected through counseling and restitution. Notes on conversations with parents. Observations about the long-term impact of public scandal in small towns. Final outcome? Avoided permanent record. Monitored progress. The pattern repeated. These were not crimes being hidden. They were moments intercepted before they hardened into something irreversible. That was the second thing I hadn't expected. If this had been a trove of damning evidence, proof of corruption deliberately concealed, I would have felt a different kind of adrenaline. Outrage. Urgency. Instead, what I felt was something more complicated. This archive wasn't weaponized. It was preventative. I closed the first ledger and reached for another, older one this time. The handwriting changed slightly. Same precision, different pressure in the strokes. Generational continuity. Whoever maintained this archive had inherited not just the materials, but the method. Inside, the structure remained consistent. Entries rarely exceeded a few pages. They were factual, detached. Yet threaded through the objectivity was something unmistakable. Care. Care in the way consequences were anticipated. Care in the way names were protected. Care in the way potential damage was calculated not just legally, but socially. Why keep records at all? I asked without looking up. If the goal was simply to help quietly, why document it? There was a brief pause behind me. Because memory distorts, she said. And someday, someone might need context. Context. That word kept resurfacing. I walked deeper into the room. A large oak desk stood near the window, its surface uncluttered except for one open ledger and a reading lamp. The open book seemed to mark the present year. I approached it more slowly. The latest entry described a dispute between two local business owners, a contract disagreement that, if litigated publicly, would have fractured partnerships and fueled rumor. Instead, mediation, compromise, confidential resolution. The tone remained measured, almost clinical. Yet the implications were profound. Without intervention, the town would have experienced fallout. Economic, relational, reputational. The ledger wasn't cataloging scandals. It was documenting forks in the road. I realized then that the viral image in my mind, the explosive archive, the bombshell files, had been built entirely from rumor. The reality was subtler, and subtler stories are harder to tell. Still, there was undeniable power in these shelves, not because they exposed wrongdoing, but because they contained knowledge. Knowledge of who had nearly faltered, who had been vulnerable, who had been protected from their worst day becoming their permanent identity. Information like that could be devastating in the wrong hands. I moved to a lower shelf and examined one of the archival boxes. Inside were carefully folded letters, photocopies of documents, meeting summaries. Each item cross-referenced with a ledger entry. The system was rigorous. No loose ends, no emotional commentary, just traceable fact. "This isn't scandal," I said aloud before I could stop myself. "No," she answered, "it isn't." The room didn't feel sinister. It felt heavy, not with threat, but with responsibility. That was the third shift. Up until this point, the mansion had been framed as a container of danger. Now I was standing inside something closer to a vault of trust. Every page I turned reinforced that this archive had never been used publicly. There were no redacted sections suggesting prior exposure, no notations indicating leverage applied, just preservation. Preservation of what almost happened. As I flipped through another volume, I found something that unsettled me more than any dramatic revelation could have. A short note appended to one case read, "Family unaware of extent. Decision made to contain." Contain. The word suggested choice, deliberate withholding. And that raised a new question, not about the morality of intervention, but about authority. Who decides what should remain contained? Who determines whether a truth heals or harms? The room was quiet except for the soft sound of paper turning. Sunlight filtered in through the tall window, illuminating dust motes suspended in still air. Outside, the town carried on as it always had, unaware that its alternate histories were stacked neatly on these shelves. I became acutely aware of my own role in that equation. I was here because of curiosity, because of career momentum, because rumor had pointed me uphill. But now that I stood among the ledgers, among years of carefully documented restraint, the story was no longer simple. If I wrote about this room as a scandal vault, I would be misrepresenting it. If I wrote about it as a benevolent archive, I would oversimplify it. I closed the final ledger gently and let my hand rest on the cover. The leather was warm from the light. People think this house hides darkness, I said. She met my gaze evenly. People fear what they don't understand. I looked again at the shelves, at the orderly chronology of human fragility preserved in ink. The viral hook, the locked room filled with secrets, was real. But the nature of those secrets was not what the town believed. And that changed the story entirely. I took a slow breath and glanced back toward the doorway. The hallway beyond seemed brighter now, almost ordinary. What happens, I asked carefully, if someone demands access? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward and closed the open ledger on the desk, her hand steady against the cover. That, she said, depends on who's asking. And for the first time since I'd walked through the front door of the mansion, I understood that the real tension wasn't inside the room. It was what would happen once word got out that I'd been in it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I'd seen anything shocking, but because nothing I'd seen fit the narrative I'd arrived with. The locked room was real. The shelves of ledgers were real. The meticulous records were real. But the idea that they were explosive, that they were waiting to detonate, felt less certain the longer I thought about them. Information changes depending on who holds it. In the study, those records had felt restrained, almost protective. In a newsroom, under fluorescent lights and a deadline clock, they would feel different. By morning, I'd already outlined 2 versions of the story in my notebook. Version 1. A secret archive hidden for decades in a feared mansion. A town's buried truths carefully documented. A moral question about who gets to decide what the public deserves to know. Version 2. A private record-keeping system that quietly intercepted personal disasters. A house that preserved context rather than suppressed scandal. A story about restraint. Both were technically accurate. Only one would travel fast. I started with verification. If those ledgers were going to shape anything I wrote, I needed to understand the potential fallout. I reached out to a legal consultant I'd worked with before, someone who specialized in privacy law and archival ethics. I didn't disclose names or details, just the structure. A private individual, I explained over the phone, has kept written documentation of sensitive community incidents for decades. Interventions, mediations, situations that never reached court. There was a pause on the other end. Are these records factual? He asked. They appear to be. Dates, correspondence, supporting documents. And they've never been made public? Not that I can find. He exhaled slowly. Then you're not just dealing with truth. You're dealing with consent. That word landed heavier than I expected. He went on to explain that even accurate information can cause harm when released without context or permission, particularly if it involves minors at the time of the event, or informal resolutions, or matters that were intentionally diverted from public record. Legally, he said, you might be protected if the material is true and newsworthy. Ethically, that's a different conversation. After the call, I sat at my desk staring at my notes. The power of the locked room wasn't in what it exposed. It was in what it contained. Years of potential headlines that had never become headlines. To understand the human side, I needed perspective from the town. Carefully, without disclosing what I'd seen. I reached out to a local business owner whose name had appeared in one of the earlier ledgers, an entry from over a decade ago. I didn't mention the book. I framed the conversation around community rumor and reputation. He met me in his office, a modest space above his store. When I asked about how small towns handle conflict, he gave a tight smile. Badly most of the time, he said. We pretend nothing happened, or we let gossip do the damage. And if something serious almost happened? I asked. He leaned back in his chair, considering. Sometimes, he said carefully, someone steps in before it spirals. Quietly. And you're grateful for that, even if you never talk about it again. There was something in his tone, not fear, not defensiveness. Relief. I left that meeting with more questions than answers. The viral image of the mansion as a threat felt increasingly inaccurate. The real tension lay elsewhere. The tension was in the fact that the archive existed at all. That one household had accumulated decades of intimate knowledge. That this knowledge had never been publicly weaponized. But what if it could be? Back at the hotel, I reopened my laptop and began drafting. The opening paragraphs wrote themselves. A mysterious house on a hill, a locked study, shelves of handwritten ledgers documenting lives at their most fragile moments. I described the structure of the archive, the system, the discipline. I avoided names. The more I wrote, the more I felt the gravitational pull of exposure. It would be easy, so easy, to imply that the archive itself was dangerous. To let readers project corruption into the silence. Halfway through the draft, I stopped. I pulled out my notebook and wrote a single question at the top of a blank page. What happens after this is published? Not to me, to them. I thought about the entries I'd read. The contractor whose bookkeeping mistake could have become permanent stigma. The teenager whose worst decision had been redirected before it hardened into a criminal record. The business dispute resolved before it fractured livelihoods. If I published even anonymized descriptions, people in town would connect dots. Small communities don't need full names. They operate on fragments. The archive's power wasn't that it revealed wrongdoing. It revealed vulnerability. And vulnerability, once public, rarely returns to its original shape. I met once more with the woman who owned the mansion. This time we didn't sit in the parlor. We remained in the study. The ledgers were closed, lined neatly on their shelves. Do you believe the public has a right to know this room exists? I asked. Yes, she said without hesitation. And what's in it? That depends on why they're asking. I pressed further. If I describe the archive, its scope, its purpose, but don't disclose specific entries, would that violate the trust it was built on? She considered the question carefully. The room isn't dangerous because of what it holds, she said. It's dangerous because of how it could be used. That was the fourth shift. The viral object, the locked room full of handwritten records, was not inherently scandalous. It was neutral. Its impact depended entirely on the intention behind access. Back at my desk, I rewrote the draft from scratch. Instead of framing the mansion as a ticking time bomb, I framed it as a question. What responsibility comes with private knowledge? When does preservation cross into control? When does exposure become exploitation? The story gained depth, but lost volatility. It would spark conversation, but not outrage. It would raise eyebrows, but not torches. I stared at the blinking cursor at the end of the document. It wasn't finished, but it was close. Too close. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature. Be careful what you publish. Not everyone wants history reopened. I read it twice. This wasn't panic. It wasn't even a threat. It was confirmation. Word had spread that I'd been inside the locked room, and suddenly, the archive's power felt less theoretical. I closed my laptop slowly, aware that the story had shifted again. Not because of what I'd read in the ledgers, but because of how people were reacting to the possibility that someone else might read them too. Information doesn't just hold power. The anticipation of its release does. By then, it was already too late for this story to stay quiet, and I had just stepped into the center of that anticipation. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It settled in gradually, like weather shifting before a storm you can't quite see yet. The morning after I received the anonymous message, I stepped outside my hotel and noticed something small but unmistakable. People were looking at me differently. Not openly hostile, not warm either. Just aware. Awareness travels fast in a small town. By mid-afternoon, my email inbox reflected it. Some messages were polite, curious. "Is it true you've seen what's in that room?" one asked. Others were more direct. "If there are records up there," another wrote, "the public deserves to know what's been hidden." That word again. Hidden. The viral image of the locked study had started mutating without me even publishing a word. The room itself hadn't changed. Shelves of chronological ledgers, labeled boxes, careful documentation. But outside its walls, it was becoming something else. A symbol, a threat, an opportunity. A man I'd interviewed briefly earlier in the week called me late that afternoon. He owned several properties in town and carried the kind of influence that doesn't need a title. "I hear you're working on something big," he said, voice even. "I'm working," I replied. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If there are documents in that house that involve business disputes from years ago, people deserve clarity. Some reputations were damaged unfairly." That surprised me. This wasn't a plea for discretion. It was the opposite. "You'd want those records public?" I asked. "I'd want the truth," he said. "All of it." We both understood what he was really saying. Selective release could shift power. A carefully timed exposure could rewrite old narratives. Not long after that call ended, a second message arrived, this time handwritten and slipped under my hotel door. No return address, just a folded sheet of paper. "Some mistakes were buried for a reason. Don't dig." Two opposing pressures within hours. One urging publication, one urging silence. The locked room had become leverage, even though nothing had left its shelves. I drove back up the hill that evening, not to review the ledgers, but to inform the woman who owned them that the temperature in town was rising. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she'd been expecting me. "They've started contacting you," she said quietly. "Yes." She nodded once. They would. We didn't go upstairs this time. We remained in the front hall, the staircase visible but distant. The study didn't need to be opened for its presence to be felt. "Have people asked you directly for access?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "They're waiting to see what you do." That was the fifth shift. The archive wasn't just a historical record. It was a potential tool. Different factions in town were already imagining how it might serve them, whether to clear their names or protect their silence. The room had not changed. The intent around it had. Back at the hotel, I returned to my draft. The piece was nearly complete. A measured account of the archive's existence, its structure, its philosophy of containment. I had avoided specifics. No names, no identifying details. Still, the reaction suggested that even acknowledging the locked study would destabilize something. Then my phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end was one I recognized instantly. A relative. We hadn't spoken much in recent years, but hearing his tone, strained, cautious, tightened something in my chest. "I need to ask you something," he said. "When you were up there, did you see anything about our family?" I hesitated. I had not searched for my own name in the ledgers. That omission had felt professional at the time. Now it felt naive. "I didn't look for that," I said honestly. "There were rumors," he continued, "years ago, before you left town. Things that never went public." My mind flickered back to the shelves. Decades of entries, structured, indexed, cross-referenced. "If something like that existed," he said carefully, "and you published about that room, people would assume." Assume. He didn't need to finish the sentence. After we hung up, I drove back up the hill once more. I told myself it was for completeness, for accuracy. But beneath that, there was something else. A need to know whether my own history sat somewhere on those shelves. She let me into the study without question. The room felt unchanged, calm, ordered. The viral object in its physical form remained exactly as it had been. Rows of leather spines, archival boxes, the desk by the window. I moved slowly along the shelves, scanning dates that aligned with my childhood. The system was precise. If an event had been documented, it would be here. When I found the year I was looking for, my hand hovered for a moment before pulling the ledger free. I opened it to the index page at the front. There it was, my last name. If this room had existed without mercy that year, my childhood would have been defined by a headline instead of a memory. Not bolded, not marked in red, just one entry among many. I read it standing up. The description was clinical. An allegation, a misunderstanding, a situation that could have escalated publicly. Meetings documented, evidence clarified, a resolution reached quietly. Outcome: no formal record filed. I closed the book slowly. The air in the room felt thinner, not because of shock, but because of proximity. The archive wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't just a collection of other people's vulnerabilities. It contained mine. She had remained near the doorway, giving me space. When I turned toward her, she didn't ask what I'd found. "It was contained," I said. "Yes," she replied. I looked again at the shelves, at the careful order, at the decades of forks in the road documented and redirected. If I published broadly about the archive, people would speculate. They would search their own timelines. They would revisit moments they had long considered closed. The power of the locked room was no longer theoretical, nor purely civic. It was personal. On the drive back down the hill, I understood that the next step wasn't about access anymore. It wasn't about whether the archive was scandalous or protective. It was about choice. My draft was complete. The cursor blinked at the end of the final paragraph. All that remained was the decision of what to do with it. And for the first time, the locked room didn't feel like the most dangerous place in town. My inbox did. The article was finished by midnight. It sat on my screen in clean, measured paragraphs. Careful language, no names, no specifics that could be traced back to a single family. I had described the locked study, the rows of leather-bound ledgers, the structure of the archive. I had framed it as a question of stewardship and power. It was restrained. Responsible, I told myself. But restraint doesn't neutralize impact. I reread the opening lines. A private room hidden inside a feared mansion. Decades of handwritten records documenting fragile moments in people's lives. A system of quiet interventions that had never been subjected to public oversight. Even without names, the outline alone would ignite curiosity. In a town this size, people would search their own memories. They would revisit old rumors, half-forgotten disputes, moments that had almost tipped into public shame. They would try to identify which ledger might contain their story. The viral object, the room, the shelves, the meticulously labeled volumes, had shifted again. It was no longer just an archive. It had become a mirror. And mirrors make people uneasy. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the hum of the mini-fridge in the corner of the room. I tried to imagine the morning after publication. Phones ringing, doors knocking. The mansion on the hill, no longer a distant rumor but a confirmed reality. I thought about the entry with my family's name, the calm tone, the clinical summary of what could have been a public unraveling. If someone else had written about that moment, if it had become an article instead of a contained ledger entry, my life would have taken a different shape. That was the final piece I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The archive had not just preserved other people's dignity. It had preserved mine. I drove back to the mansion before dawn. The sky was still pale, the town quiet. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. "You've decided something," she said. "I'm not sure yet," I answered. We went upstairs together. The study felt unchanged, calm, ordered, waiting. The desk by the window held the current year's ledger, closed now, its cover smooth beneath the morning light. I walked along the shelves slowly, not to reread entries, but to absorb the scale of it again. Decades. Hundreds of decisions to intervene quietly rather than publicly. Hundreds of forks in the road. "What was the guiding rule?" I asked without turning around. "When you decided whether something stayed here or went elsewhere?" She considered that. "If releasing it would heal more than it harmed," she said, "we let it move forward. If it would only satisfy curiosity, it stayed." Curiosity. The word stung slightly. Journalism is built on curiosity, on the belief that sunlight clarifies, that exposure corrects imbalance. But standing in that room, surrounded by evidence of contained crises, I had to confront a more uncomfortable truth. Not all sunlight is restorative. Some of it scorches. I pulled the latest ledger from the desk and opened it to a blank page at the back. The handwriting in the previous entries was steady, consistent. Whoever wrote them understood the weight of record-keeping. "This room was never meant to disappear," she said quietly behind me. "It was meant to endure." That was the sixth shift. The archive wasn't just about the past. It was about continuity. It assumed future stewards, future judgment. It was a long view, not a breaking news mindset. I closed the book and placed it back where it belonged. "If I publish as written," I said slowly, "the house becomes a spectacle. Even without names, people will speculate. They'll try to match years to memories. They'll test each other." "Yes," she said. "If I publish nothing, I become complicit in secrecy." She didn't respond this time. She didn't need to. The choice wasn't binary. It never had been. Back at the hotel, I opened the document one last time. I read it through carefully, then began editing. Not trimming for length, but shifting emphasis. The locked room remained central. The shelves, the ledgers, the structure of the archive, they were still there. But I reframed the core of the piece. Instead of asking what secrets were being hidden, I asked what responsibility accompanies private knowledge. Instead of implying potential scandal, I focused on restraint. The article became less about what was inside the ledgers and more about the philosophy behind keeping them. I removed a paragraph that described how easily such an archive could be abused. I replaced it with one about how easily vulnerable moments can define a person if exposed prematurely. The story was no longer an invitation to dig. It was a challenge to reflect. When I finished, I leaned back and read the final line. It didn't feel explosive. It felt steady. I hovered over the send button longer than I'd hovered over publish the night before. I reopened the original draft, the one that leaned harder, the one that hinted at what could be inside those shelves. My finger moved to publish, not send to my editor. Publish. For a second, I let myself imagine it. The headline spreading, the mansion trending, the locked study no longer quiet. And then I thought about the leather spines on those shelves, the years stamped in gold, the entries that were never meant to survive outside that room. I closed the tab. I sent it to my editor with a short note. This isn't a scandal piece. It's about boundaries. Then I closed the laptop and sat still. The locked study would remain locked. The shelves would remain intact. The ledgers would continue to record forks in the road. My article would confirm the room's existence, but it would not turn it into a spectacle. The choice wasn't about protecting a building. It was about protecting intention. My phone buzzed a few minutes later, a message from my editor. This is thoughtful, unexpected. Let's run it. I didn't feel triumph. I felt relief. Outside, the town was beginning to wake, cars moving, lights turning on. The hill where the mansion stood looked the same as it always had, solid, distant, unremarkable from below. But something had shifted. Not in the room, in me. And as the article prepared to go live, I understood that the real story had never been about what was written in those ledgers. It was about what I would choose not to write. When the article went live, nothing exploded. No lawsuits, no public accusations. The mansion on the hill didn't suddenly become a tourist attraction, and the locked study didn't turn into a spectacle. What changed was quieter than that. People stopped calling it a cursed house. They started calling it what it was, a place where records were kept carefully. The shelves of handwritten ledgers, the chronological rows of years, the simple oak desk by the window. They remained exactly as I first saw them. The viral image, the locked room full of secrets, never disappeared. It just matured. It became less about what could be exposed and more about what had been preserved. I think back to that moment in my hotel room, the cursor hovering over publish, and I realize the real tension was never about scandal. It was about restraint. Those ledgers weren't powerful because they contained dirt. They were powerful because they documented mercy, context, second chances. And once I understood that, the story changed shape. Not everything hidden is malicious. Not every truth needs a spotlight to matter. Sometimes, the most responsible thing you can do with information is decide how and whether to release it. If you've ever had to choose between being right and being careful, you probably understand that feeling. I'd love to hear what you would have done in that moment. And if stories like this, where the most dramatic choice is the quiet one, mean something to you, stick around. Somewhere up that hill, the study door is still locked. The shelves are still lined in leather. And the last ledger I touched is resting exactly where I placed it back. Not erased, not exposed, just kept. Some stories are safest where they were written.